Hello, everyone, and welcome. So the motivation of this learning lab is that rapid shifts in global and national food systems have profound implications for the nutrition well-being of people globally and for the planet itself. In the context of these rapid shifts that are driven by globalization, climate change, expanding population numbers, migration, and other forces, the promotion of the provision, choice, and consumption of sustainable, healthy diets has never been more critically needed. And this need is especially salient in low and middle income countries because these countries are most rapidly experiencing the effects of these forces and are positioned much more poorly than our high income countries to manage the consequences of unsustainable and unhealthy diets for chronic disease burden and the accompanying economic costs. Individuals make food choice decisions of what, when, and why to eat what they do. And food environments are the interface between the food systems and the individuals who make those food choices. And so viewing promotion of sustainable, healthy diets through both the lens of food choice and the lens of the food environment in which individuals make and execute food choice ties individual perspectives and behaviors to food environments and food systems. And so the integration of knowledge, understanding, and action from both lenses is essential for promoting sustainable, healthy diets. So it's in this spirit that this learning lab addresses challenges to developing actions to promote sustainable, healthy diets with a special focus on low and middle income countries. Our aim is that participants, all of you in this learning lab, will come away with understanding the state of evidence and what works to promote sustainable, healthy diets in low and middle income countries, and that you come away with insights on how to position strategies and actions to increase uptake and scaling. And we invite you to use the chat box to tell us what you hope to get from participating in this learning lab. So we've organized two panels. Each panel will have a short set of presentations followed by panel discussion and questions and answers with the participants. The first panel will address evidence for what works in understanding, assessing, and promoting sustainable, healthy diets in low and middle income countries across different populations and contexts. This panel will be introduced by Dr. Christopher Turner, who's a research fellow in food systems and public health nutrition in the Natural Resources Institute at the University of Greenwich. And then the second panel will address how to position context-specific innovative strategies and actions for uptake and scaling. This panel will be introduced by Dr. Inge Brouwer, who is an associate professor at the Division of Human Nutrition and Health at Wageningen University in the Netherlands. So I'll turn it over to Chris.
Thanks, Ed. I just shared my screen there. Can you just confirm that you can see that okay?
Yes.
Brilliant. Well, thanks for that introduction, Ed. That's really nice. Hello, everybody. My name's Chris Turner. As Ed's already said, I'm a research fellow in food systems and public health nutrition at NRI, the University of Greenwich. And today I've got the pleasure of chairing this exciting panel session on food systems concepts and the importance of a food systems lens for the promotion of sustainable and healthy diets. So we're going to start off this session with a poll. So if I can just ask the organizers to put in the first poll question to get you going. So as you can see there, hopefully that's popped up on your screen now. We have, first of all, we want to know what sector you're going to be working in. That'd be interesting to know for us. And then we're going to move on to a couple more poll questions as well. One on food systems concepts as well. And we can see quite a few from universities. Charities as well, that's interesting. Research institutes. That seems to be somewhat stabilizing. So we have the majority from universities and then charity, non-profit or civil society, followed by research institutes, government agencies and foundations and trusts and private sectors. That's brilliant. Okay, can we take the next question as well on disciplines? Or is that part of this poll? Still have a few responses. Okay, let's end that one there. That poll's closed. As you can see, the majority from universities, as I said before, then charity and non-profits and civil society, followed by government agencies, foundations, and trusts. It's a really nice distribution there across, obviously, with the majority being from universities, but interesting to see the other groups there as well. And now I can see, now I can see the second parts here. So we have nutrition as the lead, followed by public health, and then food systems, which is interesting, considering the overlaps between the two. There's some social scientists in the house. I'm pleased to see that. A few economists, and then agriculturists as well. So I'm just going to share those results. I'll stop sharing. I'm not sure if this is working now. Can you see this okay, Zach? Can we get to the next poll question on food systems concepts? Okay, brilliant. So this is a very easy one. So first of all, have you used food systems frameworks in your work? And if yes, could you please explain which ones you've used in the chat box and how you've used them? And we'll collate these responses in the background, and we can revisit these in the Q&A at the end. So as we can see, I'm just waiting for a few more responses. This is nice. We have a 50-50 split roughly. A couple not sure. Hopefully you'll be more enlightened by the end of the session. So let's end that there and get moving so we don't take too much time. So yes, we have just close to 50% have, and then the rest either haven't or they're not sure. So that's great. I think we can end that poll there. Can I just click off that now? Will that work? Okay. When putting together this session today for panel session 1 for the Learning Lab, I was really thinking this year as somewhat a seminal year in terms of thinking of the broader landscape of the Food Systems Summit and how we might consider, take this as an opportunity for reflection to consider this evolution of these food systems concepts. Sorry, I keep getting the poll popping up here. Trying to share it and stop sharing. Can we cancel that now, Zach? Thumbs up from Zach. I'll try and click it off. So in the past 10 years or so, we've really seen these significant developments in the food systems agenda, as Ed's already mentioned, in the way that food systems have been conceptualized. We've also already started to see how these concepts have been operationalized or put into use, and how they're continuing to evolve and adapt. And so all of this ties in really nicely with the scope of the session today. So firstly, I'll be presenting on food systems concepts from past, present, and future, based upon a narrative review of food systems concepts that I'm working on with some colleagues at NRI. We'll then hear from Dominic Rowland. He's a research fellow at the Actions Against Stunting Hub and also a PhD candidate at LSHTM at SOAS at the University of London. And he's going to talk about work that he's been leading with the Stunting Hub to operationalize concepts and develop a food environment metric. And then last but not least, we'll hear from Shilpa Konstantinides, who's a research associate at the Drivers of Food Choice program at the University of South Carolina. And she's going to talk about how we've been using concepts from food environments to synthesize the learnings from the Drivers of Food Choice projects, and also how this has informed the future directions of these concepts. So we'll then head to a 15-minute Q&A, as Ed's already mentioned, but I think without further ado, we'll get going because time is marching on. In terms of this first presentation, this is pitched as an intermediate level. So I can see already from the poll that the majority, or close to half, so roughly half, have some experience of food systems frameworks. It's not necessarily imperative, but I think hopefully by the end of the presentation you'll have achieved these learning objectives. And the first really is to define a food system and its key components. Second there is to understand how food system components have evolved over time and recognize the potential avenues for future exploration. And the third is really to understand why we conceptualize a food system and what the key challenges are. I'm just going to move this to this side here. That's good. And so first of all, how do we define the food system? And this is clearly a challenge, given the broad scope of the challenge that we face. But the HLP in 2014 did a great job in that they noted that the food system gathers all of these elements and activities that relate to the production, processing, distribution, preparation, and consumption of food. as well as the output of these activities, including socioeconomic and environmental outcomes. And if you look at this diagram to the left-hand side here from colleagues at the Centre for Food Policy at City University, you can really see how the food system spans these 5 broad themes, each of which overlap and interact with each other, and each with their own distinctive aspects. And so the question is if this is how we define the food system, then how did we get here? Have you ever even considered this? Those of you who've been working in this area for 30 or more years or so may likely have experienced the evolution of these concepts, although perhaps you haven't paused to reflect on it as such. Those who are relatively new to this area, such as myself and other early career researchers, may take these concepts as written, or perhaps better said, drawn, without having really considered their historical evolution. And so, as I said, I've been working on a narrative review of food systems concepts, and today I'm going to present a snapshot from some of this work, focusing on some of the red highlighted frameworks as key examples. And this table here is very much a potted history as such. If you look at row 2 there, so that's up here, as you can see, there's been real discursive shifts from sort of availability in the 70s towards more sort of accessibility in the 90s, along with the definition of food security and the 4 pillars of food security here. This also aligns with the first food systems framework that we identified as part of this narrative review from Sobel et al. In '98. I'll go into a bit more detail on these in a moment. But then we move on, into the sort of 2000s with the Millennium Development Goals, and then looking beyond these 4 pillars. And we get the framework by Ericsson here in 2008, another key contribution. And then really from 2010 onwards, we really start to see this explosion of food systems frameworks and thinking around food systems. And this very much aligns and builds on the back of this idea of, the double burden of malnutrition and the literature on the nutrition transition, and then moving into sort of food deserts and into food environments into the mid sort of 2015 or so. And here this also aligns with the Sustainable Development Goals. And as you can see, this, as I've highlighted here in red, the HLP made a significant contribution in 2017, and then again in 2020. And these are what I'm going to focus on in the presentation today. So here's the first framework from Sobel, Kahn, and Bisoni from '98. As you can see, it has quite a linear flow to it, feeding from biophysical environments to social environments and how these feed into resources, producers, consumers, nutrition, and then health outcomes. And it's interesting to note, all of these elements do get picked up as we start, but this is really the first line in the sand in terms of what they termed at the time the food and nutrition system. So then 10 years later, as I mentioned, we have the next framework, and this is from Ericsson in 2008. And the focus really here is on drivers, and it's coming from an environmental change kind of angle or perspective, if you like. And the focus is really on how these drivers interact with these food system activities and actors, as well as these food system outcomes. And here, in terms of outcomes, they're very much focusing on food security, environmental security, and other societal interests. It's also interesting to note these feedback loops here. And as you can see, this is really starting to evolve this kind of thinking of a system. So then almost 10 years later, we have the HLP, which really made a significant contribution, as I said, in 2017. And so as you can see, there's been a clear restructuring to have the drivers there at the top feeding into these 3 main components of the food system at this time, which is food supply chains, food environments, and consumer behavior, and how these feed into outcomes related to diets, nutrition and health, and then multi-level impacts related to social, economic, and environmental aspects there. You can also see this is underpinned by the Sustainable Development Goals, and also 3 of the 4 pillars of food security at the bottom. So now I'm going to walk us through the most recent version, which was published in the HLP from 2020, before selecting a few key areas for further elaboration. So as you can see, this refined version here really expands upon these broader drivers at the top and really starts to elaborate on some of these key areas. And as you can see there, they then identify these 6 key components of the food system. And these include production and support systems, food supply chains, and then this sort of dash box here relating to food environments, which spans supply chains, consumer behavior, and diets, and again, feeding into nutrition and health outcomes, and then broader level impacts. Another key contribution of this framework was this expanded definition of food security within this right to food framework at the bottom here. And this is something I'm going to pick up on in a moment. So one of the key contributions of this framework really was, again, situating food environments as this interface within the wider food system. And Ed's already mentioned this in the introduction today. But as you can see, this really sort of pushed this agenda, along with these reports that supported it around this time from sort of 2015 onwards. So there's a lot of momentum around food environments at this time. In the top left-hand corner there, you can see a diagram that we included as part of a paper that I published for my PhD research. really it's sort of seeking to unpack this interface of the food environment and these four main sources of food. So we have market-based sources of food, own production, wild food harvesting, and gifts and transfers, and that's the A to D there in that diagram. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I'm sure many of you will have seen this in recent years. We've presented this at previous conferences, but this is the conceptual framework that we published as part of the Agriculture, Nutrition and Health Food Environment Working Group. As you can see, we took a socio-ecological approach to identify these external and personal domains. I'm not going to spend too much more time on this because Shilpa is also going to present this in her work as well. But it's just worth noting that some of these concepts have been adapted, for example, by UNICEF and GAIN in 2019, as well as Raza et al. More recently in a special issue of Global Food Security on food systems for children and adolescents. And if you're interested in this theme, then I'd really recommend sort of taking a read at that special issue. As you can see here, they've included external food environments and personal food environments in conjunction with food supply chains and the behaviors of caregivers, children and adolescents as these determinants of child and adolescent diets. So another key contribution from the HLP from 2020 was this expanded definition of food security, as I've already said. As you can see here, they've built upon the long-standing pillars of availability, accessibility, stability and utilization with these additional components of agency. And here they're very much referring to the role of actors in enacting change. And this is very much aligned with the food systems transformation agenda that you would have seen in the first table that I presented, as well as sustainability. So sort of moving away from stability in the short term in terms of seasonal and annual sort of cycles to more sort of the longer outlook. So very briefly then, just onto some future conceptual directions. There's currently a lot of momentum around the concept of resilience. This is reflected in Action Track 5 from the Food Systems Summit around building resilience to vulnerabilities, shocks and stress. It's also been picked up on in a number of recent funding calls and conferences on this theme. And I think it's fair to say this has been catalyzed by the current pandemic, but it's also builds on a groundswell of interest from recent years, from around 2017 onwards. And I recently attended a conference held by Chris Bene et al. And there was a really interesting discussion here around resilience as a potential seventh pillar of food security, or whether it should actually be sort of integrated within the concept of stability in some way. And I guess if it's resilience, then whose resilience is it? Is it resilience of the food system? Is it resilience of consumers, or ideally both? And if so, then what are the key aspects of resilience that we're looking at? Well, I saw this presentation by Bart de Steen, who's in Peters a few weeks ago on resilience, and he was talking about the ABCD of resilience in terms of food systems resilience building. And he talked about agency in relation to the means and capacities of people to mitigate risks and respond to shocks. He talked about buffering in terms of building resources to fall back on in the face of shocks. Connectivity in relation to communications between actors. And I would also add here social capital as well in relation to that. And then also diversity. And here he was talking about diversity of scale, of place, of processes throughout the food system. He also noted that in many cases, these aspects of resilience have been eroded due to quests for efficiency and maximization, particularly in relation to, for example, crop yields or profits, for example. But I think it's also worth noting that there are some examples and positive examples of resilience, both at the food systems level and at the sort of consumer level, that can be drawn from this experience of the pandemic, and that we can look to build on going forwards as well. And this is something we've picked up on in a paper that I've been collaborating on with a colleague at NRI on some data from the UNSCN in a poll that they did right at the very beginning of the pandemic. And resilience was a really key theme that came out of that as well. So before we go to the next panel members, I just thought I'd close with two rhetorical questions. First, why do we conceptualize a food system? Well, it can help us describe these complex phenomena. It can obviously help us build a cohesive research agenda if done well. And it can help us guide research practice in terms of the design and implementation of research projects, as well as methods and metrics. It can also help us to identify key points for targeted interventions that promote sustainable and healthy diets, and also provide a framework to map and disseminate data and findings. And here to the right-hand side is a good example of this. This is the Food Systems Dashboard by Fanzo et al. And the link's there at the bottom. If you've not seen this before, I'd really encourage you to go and have a play around. It's a really interesting and innovative tool. But as you can see, they've really used the HLP's framework from 2017 to be able to collect and collate this data, as they say in this tagline here, to describe, diagnose, and help decision-making to improve diets and nutrition. So then finally, what are the key challenges? Well, there are a number of them. First of all, how do we represent and communicate complex phenomena in a clear and coherent way? You may argue that in this short presentation today, that's something I've struggled and grappled with in terms of, such a short time, such a lot of frameworks, such a lot of concepts. But it's worth reflecting that obviously decision makers and policymakers and stakeholders often don't have time to ponder these complex frameworks, and sort of it can be difficult to communicate with them due to the complexity. And so this is a clear challenge. Another challenge is reflecting this rapidly evolving agenda, as you've seen in that table from the introduction there. Even with the space of 5 to 10 years or so, there's huge shifts in the food systems agenda. And these frameworks do tend to be somewhat a timestamp, if you like, of current thinking at any given one time point. And then also a big key challenge is harmonizing these definitions and concepts for multiple disciplines and also different research themes. And Ben et al. Mentioned in the conference that I talked about earlier about this notion of fractured consensus, particularly around food security and food systems, but also resilience too, in terms of that whilst there may be general consensus, for example, if you take food security as an example, in terms of the definition that's been around for a long time and has only recently been updated, there is often differences in this fractured consensus in the way that it's operationalized in different settings and by different researchers and that kind of thing. He also picked up on a really interesting concept about the evolution of these concepts in terms of food security as this incumbent concept that's been around for a while, food systems as this relative newcomer, and then resilience as this disruptor, or in his words, this badass concept, which I think a lot of people are trying to get a grasp on at the moment and get their heads around in terms of how can we usefully use this in relation to food systems and food security. And then just finally, before I move on to let Dominic speak, there is also this tension between increasing integration of concepts into a unified sort of systems approach, if you like, versus the risk of dilution of some of those critical perspectives and angles and the nuance that you can get by having a more focused approach. And that's also just worth reflecting on. And then very finally, the key challenge here, and this is something Dominic's going to come to talk about now, is how do we operationalize these concepts into methods and metrics? So that's all from me. I've gone on a bit longer than anticipated with a sort of little bit of technical issues there with the poll in the beginning, but I think we'll move on swiftly to Dom. So I'll stop sharing my screen. And if you'd like to take it away, Dom, that'd be brilliant.
Great, thank you. Okay. Thanks very much, Chris and Ed. Can you all see my screen okay? Great.
Yeah, that looks great.
Great, so as Chris just said, a really nice introduction. What I'm going to really try and talk about is kind of the process from starting with a framework and trying to develop a metric from it. Based upon our experience at the Action Against Stunting Hub. This is work being done with Amana and Drivers of Food Choice as well, and with Sunita and Ed in particular. And I'm going to focus really on the process and the challenges of going from a conceptual framework to a measurement tool. And the stages of development we could really break down into this why, what, and how. So first of all, we had to spend quite a long time interrogating what the purpose of the tool is, because we realized that one tool can't do everything and that you have to make choices between them. And once we decided what we want to measure, you have to work out exactly what it is that we are measuring. How do you define these concepts in a way that can be measured? And then you've got to decide on the measurement tools. So that's kind of the process that we were going through. And then, so in terms of the purpose, determining the purpose is actually a huge contrast between different approaches, some of which are better for research, some of which are better for policy. So for example, determination of causes and consequences would be a fantastic sort of research tool if you wanted to understand causal links between food environments and diets. But that might be different from a tool that was able to evaluate the impact of a food systems intervention, for example. And we also want to decide upon the level. Do we want to examine an individual food environment, like a school food environment or a home food environment? Or do we want to be able to measure in aggregate many food environments that an individual or a household might be exposed to? So what we went for was we had a target audience of policymakers, and we wanted to create a tool that would be able to identify potential levers in the food system intervention. So specifically, we were interested in those aspects of the food environment, which, if modified, might result in some kind of dietary impact. And we wanted to be able to characterize whole regions and areas and populations. So we wanted it to be able to do more than just a single food environment. And we wanted to be flexible, so it would not just do healthy or unhealthy food, but be able to be used for any particular food or food group, and be able to be repeated with multiple food groups to get dietary patterns. And we wanted it to be able to show the relative importance of different aspects of the food environment in terms of their potential impact if you modified them in the food system on diets. But not everything can be measured. So you start off with the framework and you have to reduce it down. Not everything can be measured, and you don't necessarily want to measure everything as well. So lots of the things that are important but can't be influenced via a food systems intervention, we leave out because the specific focus is on those aspects that can be influenced. So once we've kind of worked out what we wanted to do, there is still various different approaches to how you'd want to go about it. So, for example, you might want to do a perception of the food environment. So how does a respondent feel about their own food environment, or in the respondent's own view, what is their food environment? Then there's food choice, experience of food choice. So you can ask about self-reported reasons behind food-related decisions, acquisition or consumption decisions. You may want to characterize a profile. You may want to characterize or profile a consumer. So are they price sensitive? Are they time sensitive? Are they influenced by the healthfulness of food? Or another option is the experience of the food environment, which is to what extent has a respondent interacted with the food environment in terms of both exposure and in terms of use. And so the last one is what we really went for, an experience of the food environment. So we wanted this interaction between the personal and the external domains, and focus specifically on experience. And there is an implied causal mechanism here, which is that exposure to different aspects of the food environment has an influence on diets, but we want to leave it without assuming a unidimensional or unidirectional causal relationship with diet, and also recognize that there's reverse causality here, in that sometimes food environments can reflect aggregate demand. And our approach really was to identify trade-offs between priorities, between household priorities, based around this concept of constraints and friction. And we define those as things that are more or less likely to lead to acquisition or consumption by increasing or decreasing the difficulty of acquiring or consuming a particular food. So that's to go beyond just saying something is important. Something may be important, but it may not actually be a limiting factor or a constraint on consumption. So we really wanted to frame it in a way that could identify those things. So then we moved on to how are we going to measure it? And there's a huge range of food environment tools that exist, and we reviewed a huge number of them. And it can broadly be broken down into these 4 categories, but there's a trade-off between all of these categories. So some of them are excellent for large scales, some of the GIS measures, some qualitative methods are probably the best for that in-depth contextual understanding. And market surveys are pretty good at identifying prices and availability, but less good at identifying aspects of the food environment, or unable to account for people's mobility across space and time. So we wanted to we used the activity space-based approach, which is sort of the intersection between the personal and the external. And we define that by the places that people go and the times that they go to them. And that can be both where food acquisition has occurred and the places and times they go where food acquisition was possible. So their exposure to an interaction with these aspects of the food environment. And so what we're trying to develop is this household survey instrument that measures a household member's interaction with the food environment, which is a multidimensional construct within their activity space, with a focus on priorities, constraints, and friction. And we used the constructs from the Turner framework to start with, combined with formative literature, formative field work in our pilot sites and literature. but we've really focused on the constructs which are known to influence dietary intake and can be influenced via food system intervention and can be easily measured. And so it's just some reflections really on the challenges of moving from a conceptual framework to a measurement tool. The conceptual frameworks are vital for understanding and emphasizing the complexity. So this is so much more than a list of constructs. It would be very easy just to list everything that's listed in the Turner framework and say, okay, well, we'll just measure each one of these in turn. But actually the framework is so much more than that. It's highlighting the complexity and the interaction between these things. And it's important to keep that in mind when developing tools. But that's also challenging because conceptual frameworks are multidimensional, but scales and metrics require a set of unidimensional constructs with which to measure. And then identifying the level and the object of measurement is actually a lot more challenging than you often think, because sometimes in these conceptual frameworks, you'll be mixing personal, individual level factors, household level factors, community level factors, and identifying the object of measurement it can be challenging. I'd also warn that there are some dangers as well of metric development, in particular the danger that a metric becomes a definition. So I think that's another important role of conceptual frameworks, is to allow the definition to be much broader than the metrics used to measure it. And it's not a substitute for context specific qualitative research. And you also need to think about issues such as reverse causality, and remembering that metrics were designed for a specific purpose, and that using them in a different context they may not be validated or even relevant for those kind of purposes. So that's just some general reflections on the process, and I'll hand over now. I think I'm a little bit over time.
Thanks, Tom. That was brilliant. That's a great overview. So now we're going to move on swiftly to Shilpa, if you're ready.
Yep, let me just share my screen. Oh, Dom, you have to stop sharing. Okay. So again, my name is Shilpa Konstantinidis. I'm a research associate with the Drivers of Food Choice Competitive Grants Program. Thank you, Chris and Dom, for those really interesting presentations. I think they lead really nicely now into what I'm going to share about some work that we've done recently to inform future directions for food systems research in low and middle income countries. And I'd like to thank the rest of the study team and the investigators that contributed their evidence and experiences to this work. So the first learning objective of this presentation is, in combination with and after what you already heard this morning, to understand concepts of the food environment and food choice. Then I hope that you'll be able to appreciate if and how food environment concepts can be useful in understanding drivers of food choice. And finally, we want you to be able to recognize if and how food environments can be useful in understanding and comparing global strategies that promote sustainable, healthy diets. So as it's been said already, the global food system is changing rapidly due to urbanization, globalization, technologies, climate change, migration, and longer supply chains. And global interest is strong in improving understanding of the drivers of food choice in this context and the consequently altered food environments, with the goal of improving dietary, nutrition, and health outcomes through policy and program action. So food environments are the physical, economic, political, and sociocultural context through which individuals interact with the food system to make choices about food, which include how to acquire, store, prepare, distribute, and consume food. And so in response to the need for more knowledge on these topics, especially in low and middle income countries dealing with this rapid nutrition transition, and in the context of these changing food systems, the Drivers of Food Choice program seeks to facilitate, synthesize, and disseminate research to improve the understanding of the drivers of food choice among the poor in developing countries in South and Southeast Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, funding 15 projects across 10 LMICs. So as Chris discussed earlier in this session, frameworks align theoretical concepts and empirical research to set research agendas and inform targeted policies and interventions. In 2018, as he said, the ANH Food Environment Working Group published this framework, which seeks to unpack the food environment as an interface within the wider food system. It identifies external and personal food environment domains drawing from socio-ecological theory. And the external food environment refers to exogenous opportunities and constraints that influence food choice, while the personal food environment refers to individual level influences on food choice. So to see if these concepts are useful in understanding drivers of food choice in LMICs, we sought to determine whether the framework allows researchers to identify and study relationships between food environments and food choice at that interface between the individual and the food system in diverse LMIC contexts and using evidence from the DFC project. We then used that evidence to identify potential gaps in the understanding of the food environment as represented by the framework. So we developed a data extraction matrix, which was populated by the principal investigator of each project. We gathered data on the study characteristics, the food environment subdomain studied, outcomes studied, empirical results, and also asked for reflections on the usefulness and possible missing characteristics within the framework. We conducted a thematic analysis to identify common drivers of food choice within the food environment across the countries represented by the projects, and to identify emergent important characteristics that may not explicitly be described in the framework. So on average, investigators addressed 5 of the 8 subdomains listed in the framework, suggesting that the domains and subdomains from the framework are useful in operationalizing concepts of the food environment in studies of its relationship with food choice in LMICs. The drivers within the food environment most consistently found by investigators to be important in influencing food choice are circled in red, and were prices and affordability, availability, and vendor and product properties, particularly in relation to food quality and food safety. Accessibility, convenience, desirability, and marketing and regulation, circled in green, were also described as important across project, but less consistently so. Investigators also identified several characteristics of the food environment that were not explicitly listed in the framework, which we then classified into 5 constructs: perspectives on food safety, social forces, gender dynamics, stability, and wider food system drivers. And these constructs differ from the existing subdomains in that 4 of them apply to both the external and the personal food environments. And the 5th construct of wider food system drivers reaches beyond both domains of the food environment. So investigators found it difficult to classify these observations into the existing domains and subdomains of the framework, indicating the need for continued iterative development of food environment concepts in line with the evolving nature of the study of food environments and drivers of food choice. So in summary, the framework provided the breadth and depth of content necessary to synthesize understanding across the projects of common drivers of food choice within the food environment, but we also gained new insights on 5 emergent constructs related to the food environment, 4 of which cut across food environment domains. So more considerations now needed to think about how to represent these constructs in future iterations of the framework, as well as how to include them in research and policy and program action aimed at improving food choice through the food environment. And continued iterative development of conceptual and empirical food systems and food environments research is needed in LMICs, as well as globally. So another way in which we examined the usefulness of food environment frameworks was by applying these concepts to an analysis comparing global initiatives promoting sustainable, healthy diets. These global initiatives are increasingly focusing on food systems, recognizing the need for comprehensive interventions that address food production, food consumption, and everything in between. So we applied food environment concepts for multiple frameworks presented earlier to answer 2 questions. How do recommended actions in global nutrition initiatives seek to promote sustainable, healthy diets? And are these recommendations similar or different across global nutrition initiatives? So this work was recently presented at the American Society for Nutrition. I'll just summarize the results for you here. After reviewing 12 high-profile global nutrition initiatives, we identified 13 overarching themes of policy action recommendations, which you can see here in the left column. The second column shows you how many of those documents contained each policy action theme. We then unpacked each action to determine whether the documents recommended strategies that targeted the food environment, food choice, or both. And the results are seen here in the 2 columns on the right. Food environment strategies are represented well in nearly every action theme, with the exceptions of improving nutritious food acceptability and promotion of nutritious traditional foods. In contrast to that near universal representation, food choice strategies are not as well represented across the action themes. And if we accept that these themes demonstrate ways in which we can bring about improvements in the promotion of sustainable, healthy diets through strategies focusing on the food environment and food choice, we see that these initiatives are primarily focused on the food environment. And for only 3 action themes was the opposite true. So in conclusion, we see that food environment frameworks, as demonstrated by applying the Turner et al. Framework, can help in understanding drivers of food choice in LMICs, but must continue to evolve to capture additional constructs relevant in these settings. We also see that the use of food environment concepts helps us to understand how global initiatives aim to promote sustainable, healthy diets. But our analysis shows that much more attention is being paid at this global level on actions aimed at improving the food environment, rather than actions aimed at directly improving healthy food choices. So thank you for your attention. I look forward to engaging with you during the discussion portion of this session.
Thanks, Shilpa. That was great. A really great overview. I realize we're already running short on time. I think, how about we just take 5 minutes now for a quick Q&A on this initial session. We have a couple of questions and then we can move on and we can leave more time for the questions at the end. Is that okay, Ed and Christine? You happy with that? Nods. Good. Okay, brilliant. So we had a couple of really interesting questions in the chat box. I'm just going to share my screen. The first one actually related to this table I presented in my presentation, and I'm just going to see if I can pull up who was asking that question. Let's see here. Yes, so yeah, Yanni Armstrong asked, so the first table that Chris presented, does food security metamorphosize into food systems? And if so, is there a specific moment when it happens, or is it gradual? In response to that, let me just share this here. Hopefully you can see that now, okay. So in response to that, I don't think it metamorphosizes as such, and that's kind of what I was driving at the end there in terms of this idea around fractured consensus around these interrelated themes and topics. And I think, many people have recognized for a long time, particularly in relation to food security, food systems, food environments, the overlapping use of terminology and some of these perspectives. And clearly there's been, many people are working across these theme areas. I don't think there's necessarily a metamorphosis as such, and that's kind of why I've kept them here in separate columns. I think it would be interesting, to delve deeper into this and explore, and that's part of what we're going to do in this narrative review process, how these food security concepts have evolved in relation to these, as well as this wider discourse and events that happened in the background. And then again, to do the same for resilience. And, I'll put my hands up and say resilience is a new area for me. I'm just dipping my toes into the murky waters. But I think, it's something that there's a lot of literature on that as well, which runs in parallel to this. And I think there was quite a lot of resilience maybe sort of 10, 15 years ago, and now it's seeing this resurgence again. So particularly interesting to see. I don't think they're necessarily metamorphosized as such, but I hope that answers your question. Then we also had another question, or more of a comment as well, which I can just take now before we open up to any live questions, just on these future conceptual directions as well here. In terms of resilience, but then also there's comments about equity as well. And I'm just going to let you behind the curtain here and show you that I actually had equity as an additional box here in the recent presentation, and then due to time constraints, I had to remove that because I didn't want to include it and then not have time to explain about it. But if you are interested in this area, this is definitely the other big area, resilience and equity, where we're seeing a lot of interest at the moment. And I know that one of my colleagues, and I'm not even sure she may be on today, but Jodie Harris has been doing a lot of great work around this area, particularly on developing a framework for equity in nutrition research. And if you're interested in that, I think that's probably in the stages of being published now, but keep an eye out for that because it's really, really interesting. And she came to NRI, or gave a talk at NRI that was really interesting on that theme too. So do you have any open questions just before we move on, or can we take them all at the end? I'm happy to do either. I can't see any. Shall we move on?
Hey, Chris, I think there's a couple of comments and questions on the side. We have a couple minutes, I think.
Okay.
We can go. There's maybe if you want to summarize we put a summary of the food systems frameworks people are using.
Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah, so in terms of the responses to the poll, we had a range from the ANH Food Environment Framework to the HLPE, the Food Systems Dashboard Framework. I think that's interesting. That's going to come up in panel 2, I believe. And then the Angelo Framework, that's something I'm not familiar with, so that's particularly interesting. I'll need to look that up. And then also the Rural Food and Nutrition System and Food Insecurity Framework, and then Cantor et al., which is one of the other ones. Actually, I think it was 2012, wasn't it? That's one of the ones I wanted to include as well, but had to remove due to time. So yeah, there's clearly been a whole range, and it's interesting to see here that I'm quite pleased to see that many people have seen the ones that I selected as these kind of key time points. That these are the ones that people are familiar with. But obviously, as you've seen in that slide there, and as I said, the slides are made available. So, please do take a Google search around some of those frameworks, because there is a huge host, especially as I said from 2010 onwards, and around that time point there, where there is a lot of different concepts put forward, and very similar, but all in slightly different, nuanced ways, depending on the different angle and perspective they're bringing onto it. So we have another couple of comments here as well. So we have a comment from Payman Milani, I believe, saying on Dom's presentation, saying great point on the dangers. Also, we need to be aware of confusion indicators with actual outcomes as well. I think that's a really, really pertinent point raised there too. And then we also have another one on from Holly, I believe, on the resilience capacities that Bene has put forward in his research too, about resilience capacities being absorbative, adaptive, and transformative. And that's right as well. And he's recently put out a paper in 2020 on resilience in food systems in relation to COVID in particular, and the pandemic and the impacts on that. So if you're interested in resilience and food systems, then do take a look at that as well, because that's quite a rich paper and quite in depth in terms of the concepts and the treatment of that. So do take a look at that. It's something I need to take a close look myself. I've only sort of skimmed read through it, to be completely honest. And then there is one last question here before we go. I'm going to read this on the fly from Jasmine Fladayon, I think. So the question is, there are some quite reasonable and important critiques of the notion of resilience as placing too much emphasis on individual choices and thereby individual responsibility, potentially diminishing the very important structural drivers of inequalities. And I wonder whether the panel thinks the idea of a food system, which by definition examines structural drivers, can address this critique. And I think that's a really, really insightful question and comment there. And actually, the conference that I mentioned that I'd recently attended that was led by Bene and colleagues, there was a very much, I think that crowd of people at the conference were very much entrenched within food security and resilience, and less about food systems. So there was a lot of talk around the first two, and it's worth noting, I think the conference title was Food Security and Resilience in a Food Systems Context. So do Google that as well if you're interested, because I'm sure there'll be materials online, but there was a lot of debate around that kind of angle. And I think, you know, approaching resilience from a food systems perspective, you know, can potentially be a new angle, which would be really helpful, bring something new. But as I said, there is this fractured consensus, and, you know, already just between, I would say, between food environments, food systems, you know, we've spent a lot of time trying to unpack what that means. But I think there's clearly more to be done here. And there's been this ongoing tension in the background between, obviously, the terms like availability and accessibility, particularly accessibility, which has been central to the, you know, the definition of, and one of the key pillars of food security, and how that terminology is used within food systems and food environment research, which, you know, there's clearly a tension and an overlap there as well, which is one of the reasons why we've been sort of with the ANH working group as well. We were pushing for food acquisition practices rather than food access in terms of, you know, economic, physical and social access, because that's the way it's defining food security, but it does tend to complicate things when you look at it from a food systems or food environments angle. So I'm rambling a bit now. Does anyone else want to add any comments, Shilpa or Dom, or do we have any further questions?
This is Ed. I just wanted to add in one thing about, prompted by Jasmine's question about resilience. You know, back in 1992, Simon Maxwell and Tim Frankenberger wrote a monograph on household food security, they called it. And their first chapter, their first conceptual chapter is really brilliant. And it laid out a lot of really important fundamental thinking about what does resilience mean and what does vulnerability mean. And I just want to encourage people to go back to that monograph because it's a really good source of sort of just basic thinking about these ideas, and reflects the concern that Jasmine raised, that resilience has to be thought of at all levels, not just at the individual level.
Could you, that's a really great comment, Ed. Could you type that in the title of the authors and the,
yes,
and the monograph in the chat box for the participants? That'd be really, really helpful. And just as a final add on to that as well, one of the discussions that was raised at the conference I was talking about was this idea of, you know, resilience as a potential way to move beyond the household scale in a way. A lot of the research that's been done on food security and you know, food environments even to an extent has been focused on the household scale. I think resilience, you know, offers that opportunity potentially, or at least that's what the discussion was about, in terms of, you know, looking at, for example, city scales and regions and food systems at that kind of level through, you know, some of these concepts from resilience, which is not only environmental, but also social.
Okay, thanks, Christine, and welcome back to everybody. And also good to see that that we still have the crowds in, and that you didn't walk away, although it's the last learning lab of this week. So we have a session 2 lined up for you with the excellent people in a panel discussion. And as we have heard in the last presentations, that there are many challenges that prevent people to make healthier choices. And depending on who they are, where they are, what resources they have available. And we also have to realize that the consumer actually does not exist. There are many different consumers in many different challenges. And we also have to realize that there is not one challenge, but that there's a bundling of challenges that need to be addressed. And asking for packages of innovations rather than single innovations. And we have to make the research we do and the results of the research, we have to ensure that they are taken up to find solutions to enable people to make healthier choices. And stakeholder engagement is key in this. It will not only make research more relevant, but it probably will also support uptake of research findings. But we all know that this is easier said than done, because stakeholder engagement is pretty complex. I mean, which stakeholder should you engage with? How do you organize this stakeholder engagement? And then what are you actually doing when there are opposing opinions within the stakeholders? And fortunately, we have quite some experiences or examples of a diversity of strategies. And these strategies also range from more informative strategies where stakeholders are engaged to give information, to make, to get a buy-in for research, up to the other end where actually the beneficiaries are in the driving seat. So you have collaborating strategies. And I'm really happy that we have 3 very excellent panel members who are willing to share their experiences in stakeholder engagement to support uptake of results. So let me share my screen. I hope you can see my screen now. Yeah. So these are our 3 panelists, and I first would like to introduce you to them. So the first is Dr. Catherine Pittori. She is a specialist in food and nutrition security at the Wageningen Center for Development Innovation. And her work is focusing the last years mainly on translating research into action. And she will talk about a project engaging a private sector in changing food choices in South Africa. Our second panel member is Dr. Masresha Tessema, and he's director of the Food Science and Nutrition Research Directorate of the Ethiopian Public Health Institute. And I can say that he's involved in many, and if not all, nutrition-related projects that are implemented in Ethiopia. And he will share with us more about the government perspectives of stakeholder engagement in nutrition programs. And our third panelist is Dr. Rudaba Konda, and she's the country director of the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, GAIN, in Bangladesh. And she worked also in many projects around the world in integrated programs. And she will highlight the engagement with program beneficiaries, in this case, adolescents in Bangladesh. So I propose to start with short introductions by the panel members, and then we will follow with questions and answers. And I really would like to ask and stimulate our audience to ask questions or to put your comments in the chat box. And also to share with us whether you have any experiences and what you have learned in operationalizing support for the uptake of your research findings. So having said that, I would like to call upon Catherine Pittori to share with us your experiences.
Great, thank you. Let me just share my screen. Sorry. Great. Thank you, Inga, for the introduction. And like Inga said, I'll be speaking today about how we worked with private sector stakeholders in a project that we ran in South Africa. And this project was actually implemented by a large number of different stakeholders. We worked with SPAR South Africa, SPAR International, based with the Pyramid Inc., Rijksvan, which is a Dutch seed company, also with the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, who we'll hear from later, as well as Wageningen Center for Development Innovation. And it was funded through the Dutch government. So just to briefly go over the learning objectives, we want to sort of, moving away from the nice conceptual frameworks that we discussed, actually think about how do we translate these conceptual frameworks into sort of real world projects on the ground. So I was going to talk a little bit about how we worked with a variety of different stakeholders and reflect a little bit on the opportunities as maybe well as challenges of engaging with diverse stakeholders, including private sector actors. So just to understand very briefly the project overall, we looked at sort of two elements. So on the one side, we looked at low dietary diversity in rural South Africa. So we carried out a baseline survey in participating stores in rural areas and found that 90% of the population actually does not consume an adequate diet of more than 5 food groups, which is not something maybe you'd expect in South Africa, which is generally a wealthier context. We also found that food choice is mainly set by the providers. So almost all households shop for their vegetables and fruits at the supermarket, either most or all of the time. And of those, 94% bought vegetables from the SPAR. And we found key factors influencing vegetable consumption. I thought it was interesting because thinking back also that these are very similar in terms of affordability, but also distance, thinking back to the presentation we saw looking at what are those key factors influencing food choice and food environment decisions. So on the one side, we have the food and what people are consuming, and the other side, we have the food system challenges. So supermarkets source largely from large producers, commercial farmers, and they deliver in bulk to centralized distribution centers. So tend to be very long value chains with very high food miles. Commercial farmers tend to dominate, and small scale farmers really struggle to access this market. So sort of looking at not just the nutrition and health outcomes of the food system, but also looking at the sustainability side and looking at affordability issues. So we came up with what we called the rural hub concept. And this was actually developed by a SPAR owner themselves. So SPAR is an interesting supermarket in that it's not really, it is a chain, but each SPAR is its own individual supermarket and it's owned by one individual, and they make decisions about where they stock things from, how they supply their store. So one of these SPAR owners in rural South Africa was actually a farmer himself, and he wanted to be able to source better quality products for his store. So he went out and trained some local farmers and then, made arrangements to buy from them. And this story sort of trickled up through all the way to SPAR International, who thought this is a really interesting model for trying to reduce the food miles, be able to source things more locally, get higher quality products, and also hopefully increase the access to affordable fruits and vegetables, because by bringing it closer to where people buy it, that should make it cheaper in theory. So he came up with this model where we would have contracts with lots of farmers that were close to this, what they called the rural assembly points, so the fresh assembly points, and then these would be sent out to SPAR stores, and everything should be within a 200-kilometer radius. So this was the model that was developed. And also on the other side, there were also nutrition awareness campaigns. So this was radio features, newspaper insets, in-store posters and leaflets, competitions. They also hired nutritionists from the local community who would walk around and engage with consumers, tell them about the benefits of vegetables and nutrition. So on the one side, we were trying to get more vegetables into the shops, and the other side, stimulate desire for people to purchase them. So that was just a very, overview of what we were trying to do with this project. And then also, I was asked to reflect on really how did we get stakeholders involved? So we really had a lot of different stakeholders in this project. I have here just sort of a brief overview, everyone from large farmers to the small farmers, individual stores, packers, consumers, other retailers, the government who makes regulations. So really a wide variety of stakeholders that we had to engage with. So I'll just mention a few and some of the opportunities So SPAR International was key, and actually it's interesting that SPAR really views sustainability as one of their central business points. So rather than it just being a part of corporate social responsibility, they really want to make shortening the value chain and getting people closer to where the food is produced as one of their kind of key tenets of their work. So having this buy-in at the highest level really helped us facilitate access to SPAR stores. We were also interested to work with smallholders. So in South Africa, commercial farms that are large holders dominate, and we also wanted to be able to get small-scale farmers involved. So trainings were provided in things like good agricultural practices. They were also given some support with inputs from the hub. So one of the challenges, though, is that there was no actual contract between the hub and the farmer themselves. So if the prices increase somewhere else, they had no obligation to sell to the fresh assembly point. So often there were challenges in terms of getting the right quantities to the fresh assembly points, and that created some challenges with some of the farmers. There were also challenges around the high value versus lower value crops, and found that for the lower value crops, it didn't make sense for these farmers. So they had to maybe change the crop varieties they were growing. There were also the fresh assembly points themselves. So these are the rural hubs, and these were actually viewed to be they were supposed to be self-sufficient organizations, so that they would have people that were trained in grading, in packaging, in marketing as well. So they needed to hire all of these staff themselves, and they, sorry. So they ended up being that this was a very expensive operation, and in the end it was very hard to make these commercially viable. So the theory was that these would be taken over by the individual SPAR owners, who would get to have a share of them, but because they were never really commercially viable, that was a challenge. And also in the end they only set up 2 of these 3 assembly points because they were not able to really make a profit. Individual SPAR-owned stores were also another key stakeholder. So like I said, each store decides where they source their own food from. And so the good part and the bad part of this is that each store has a lot of autonomy, but that meant that we really had to get buy-in from each individual store owner individually to buy from the hub. And the hubs really had to market themselves to convince people to buy from them. And finally, we have also, obviously, the consumers, and they have to be incentivized to buy. So we did have this campaign to promote consumption of vegetables. We did find, however, that affordability was one of the critical challenges, and the campaign stopped short of offering vouchers. And I think, if this were repeated, vouchers would be a really interesting intervention, because in the end, affordability was one of the critical things stopping people from purchasing a lot of these fruits and vegetables. So just quickly, some key lessons that we learned that might be useful if you want to implement a similar type of project. So food systems include many different stakeholders, as we've all discussed. And one thing is to maybe start small, be selective, and then expand. So really start with a small group of committed people that are very interested, and then build as you gain interest and knowledge of what you're doing. Another thing we failed to do as a project was including the individual SPAR owners as a key partner from the start. These SPAR owners also had good connections to the local community. So, I think sometimes you maybe overlook critical stakeholders that you should have brought on board. And that's something, we would encourage you to really think about who you need to have on board and around the table to get started. Being adaptable. So like I said, we had to change the products, for example, that were grown by farmers. We brought in new sort of mixed packages of different vegetables packaged together. So you may have an idea of what will work, and then actually you need to change it completely. So kind of adapt and adjust as you go along. We did really find too, sometimes a challenge between diverging interest and attention between sort of the setting up the hub on the one side and the nutrition promotion on the other side. So you have to try to, find a common interest point for all of these. And we did find that nutrition was sort of something that interested many of the stakeholders and really engaged people. And that was an interesting one to sort of bring everyone along, and everyone sort of felt this commitment and responsibility to the local community. And that was, one way. And we would say maybe next time start with one element of that and then expand into other elements once you sort of have one thing going. So that is our experience from SPAR South Africa, and I will turn the floor back over to Inga. Thank you.
Thank you, Kat. That was excellent to hear the results also of your study and the stakeholder engagement that went along. I know from your stories that it was quite complicated project actually. So again, I would like to ask the audience to continue with asking questions in the chat box. There are already quite some interesting questions coming along, which we will try to answer, I would say, after the three panelists have spoken. So I would like to invite Masresha to come to the floor and to share his thoughts on stakeholder engagement.
Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you, Inga, for a very nice introduction. So I will be, in the next few minutes, I'll be briefly presenting the Ethiopian experience in addressing healthy and sustainable food consumption, in particularly in case of Ethiopia. I don't know, Inga, if my slide is visible.
Yes, it is, Masresha. If you can put it in presentation mode.
Okay. Okay. So the learning objective of this presentation is, the first one is to understand the food system policy in Ethiopia. And the second learning objective is to inform the current work in relation to the food system environment in Ethiopia. And the last one is to understand the use of evidence, especially in relation to the food system in Ethiopia. With this, my presentation will mainly focusing on the first one, on the policies and strategies that were related with the food system. And the other content also relates with some of the flagship initiatives that were undertaken by the government of Ethiopia, as well as by various governmental as well as non-governmental organizations, and also the current Ethiopian system, as well as our preparation for the Global Food System Summit. So with this, going to the policy landscape in Ethiopia, over the last 2 decades, there has been a substantial improvement in terms of the overall policy of the food nutrition as well as the food system. Starting from 2008, the nutrition programs and policy has been improved with several approach, and with the very recent one was the food and nutrition policy, which mainly focus or use the approach of food system, which is from farm to table approach, which I can say is particularly using the food system approach. We have also the food and nutrition strategies, the 10-year strategies that also mainly address the several components of food system, including the various intervention strategy. So the other component is the use of evidence in terms of food system as well as the nutrition in Ethiopia. And at the national level, we have a multi-sectorial food and nutrition coordination body. Under this coordination body, there are 3 main technical working groups, which the first one is a program component, and the second one is related with the food fortification implementation. The third one, which is the most important one for this presentation, is the food and nutrition monitoring, evaluation, and research steering committee, which the primarily committee or steering committee, which mainly advise the government in terms of decision, or also give various scientific advice in order to change or improve the program as well as various policies. So going to this, the first activities or one of the flagship initiative by the government of Ethiopia, which are directly related with the food system, is the development of food-based dietary guideline, which was started in 2018. And as informed earlier, this is also part of the steering committee, the research or advisory steering committee, which are identified. And following that, also several activity has already been undertaken as part of this project. And the main aim of this project is especially to give a dietary recommendation for the Ethiopian population in order, to have improved diet qualities, especially in the aspect of food safety, for optimal health, as well as for promoting the food system. And with this initiative, there are 4 broader phases or activities of this project. The first one is related with evidence generation, which starting from the review of existing evidence, and a number of review has been conducted. And also there has been a modeling related with the evidence, especially on the diet. And following that, also there are a technical recommendation that's mainly relying on the first activity or evidence, this also including the expert opinion. And the third one, in particularly translation of this guideline, this is also undergoing. And the final one, which will be conducted shortly, is also the piloting implementation of the guideline also there, and as well as there will be also a revision of guideline in the future. So with this, among these activities in this project, I would like to highlight the most important activity related with, especially in terms of the determinant of the food choice in Ethiopia. This review has been conducted by a number of experts under this project, and the highlight of this review shown that in Ethiopia, the consumption, especially the Ethiopian consumer population, is highly diversified, especially in terms of urban, rural, as well as in terms of religions. There is a diversity. And we also found dietary consumption behavior in particular, it is linked or associated with especially the socio-demographic characteristics, attitude, knowledge, as well as the culture, religious practice, as well as the food environmental factor. In this study also, we found that also consumers especially prefer to consume especially animal food based such as chicken, and compare with other meats. And in contrary to this also, like pigs, horse, poultry, dogs and camel, as well as cats, were not preferred food because of cultural practice in Ethiopia. And in terms of religion, both Muslim and Christian religion followers, they do not prefer to eat especially meat from pork. And in addition to this also, Orthodox religion follower, there is a fasting largely in these communities, especially fasting of animal food mainly practice, while they're preferring to eat plant-based food during the fasting season. So the other important finding in this research is food aversion, especially common in pregnant women. Despite this food aversion, they also preferred especially barley-based traditional food, largely preferred by this community. The other important finding related with the food environment or food system is a policy change, especially in relation to unhealthy food consumption. This is also recently, changed to real practice that the effect of consumption of palm oil, which is highly saturated fat. And with this, following this issue brief or a policy brief, the government made, several rules and regulation in terms of improving healthy diet in the country. And the second one also, there is a recent rules or policy enforcement in terms of, tobacco consumption. This has also come through the research evidence, especially raising tobacco's taxes, and there is also a tax that the Ethiopian smoke-free laws, which is also this year very recently endorsed law. The other one related with the healthy food is also the policy change is related with especially the excise tax related with taxation of sugar, sweetener, beverage, and unhealthy food consumption. This is also related with the government action that has been taken very recently, which WHO also recommend, and especially on those unhealthy food, especially on the edible animal vegetable fats, especially with higher saturated fat and hydrogenated fat, as well as trans fat. With this also, there has been a substantial increment of tax in those food items, which really bring the policy environment in terms of healthy and sustainable food. And the other one related with the food system is also the field nutrient gap. As we all know, the cost affordability is one of the challenge in terms of consuming healthy and affordable foods. And considering this, this is one of the decision-making tools, especially in order to prioritize an intervention. And with this also, this project is also mainly following the food system approach, and with the project is mainly aiming or focusing on the availability, access, affordability, as well as the intake of the nutritious food. And this project is also part of the government flagship initiatives, and we use various kind of data like food price data, household food expenditure data, including the consumption data. And the other one, which is an upcoming project or undergoing project related with the food system, is leveraging the food system approach for healthier and sustainable diet policy in Ethiopia, which this is also mainly to analyze the degree to which food system in Ethiopia is supporting the protective and healthy food, especially in those low income as well as the most vulnerable population. And the other important component in terms of food system in Ethiopia is also in terms of preparation to the Global Food Summit. There is a food system dialogue undergoing. This is a very high level dialogues, which is part of the Global Food System Summit. Also, the first and the second food system dialogues has been already conducted, and over 1,000 of game changer idea were identified. Among several, the game changer idea, there are 22 game changer and as well as the intervention were identified. And following that, also the positioning paper for country specific will be developed, and this positioning paper will also be presented into the upcoming Global Food Summit. With this, I thank you all for your attention, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Masraja. That was a perfect overview of what is happening in Ethiopia. I would like to continue with Udaba. Udaba, please take the floor.
Thank you very much. Good evening, good morning, and good afternoon to all. So I'll start sharing my slides. Let me go to the slide mode now. Sorry, it is taking.
Oh, we see your presentation.
Yeah.
Udaba.
Yeah, 1 minute, please. Yeah, can you see it now?
Yes, we can see, but yeah, we can see.
Yes, so welcome to all to this presentation. So I'll tell you a story. I think it's just fantastic that Chris done a polling in the beginning, which means the poll showed that we have got a lot of young people in this learning lab today. There are a lot of young people who I think with this Bangladesh story and Bangladesh experience will be helping. So the learning agenda automatically comes, and that how to use the motivation research to inform a participatory process. And this is improving the adolescent food choice in Bangladesh is what we are focusing on. I just want to give a glimpse of where we are with the adolescent nutrition situation. Bangladesh, we have 1/5 of population are adolescent. We have a high demographic dividend country, whereas the adolescents are where at one point we have got underweight stunting. On the other side, overweight and obesity is increasing. So this double burden is really giving us a lot of thinking that how do we engage in stakeholders, and especially the key stakeholder is adolescent, to design a program based on different elements and approaches from choices. We also realized that when we looked at the adolescent girls, 1 in 5 adolescent girls the girls, they do not have adequate dietary diversity, but these are very nutrition driven discussion. Now let us talk about that why they make poor choices. Like any of us, we were adolescent at one point. So one is basically when you did some study, we did 2 big study. One was about the consumer insight, what we wanted to know, why adolescents choose to eat what they eat, which is very interesting because we thought that, you know, they will be very much family based and very obedient. School will have different tiffin and canteens. It's not like all of us. When we are adolescent, there's lack of awareness and motivation of improving food choice. Actually, people, their aspiration is very important. We also, when we spoke, when Kat presented, we also looked at there is a gender, intra-household and inter-household disparities when it comes to adolescent girls and making a food choice, because often the boys are given preference, even the girls are given preference, they want to sit with their mother and eat. So these dynamics, social dynamics, plays a great role. Changing food environment also characterized by availability of unhealthy food with a lower cost, whereas healthy food with a higher cost, affordability. We have already heard from Dominic that affordability is a very important element, when also desirability plays a role, which Shilpa has highlighted, that we often, you know, think of what do we like to eat. Even in front of us, we have this beautiful food. We don't think of what is best, what is good for our health, rather than what drives us, what makes us excited to eat and why we eat it. So promotion of unhealthy food by a lot of private sectors and consumer facing campaigns and advertisements also make people, adolescents, young people, choose basically unhealthy food. So we want to look at a deep dive on the dynamics of the decision. Our brain, we looked at the brain of our logical thinking and our rational thinking. We have got our brain, which is our right brain, which is very inspirational, emotional, and we have our left brain full of rational. So when we go to a store, like if I go to Spar to talk about, I would like to buy one, get one free. I might go jump into there and buy something very interesting, which is colorful, nice, high sugar, high salt. It's all about taste. So I think it is very important to look at that. How do we make choices? And this links to the different studies of consumers studies that have come forward till now. But it is important to highlight that very little have been done till now, looking at the consumer-facing studies, looking at the adolescents' motivations. Because when we have looked at the ethnographic studies, we have realized only nutrition doesn't play a role. Their lives, how they dream, what are their aspirations. All these come into play when they make a choice of food, and food choice come to the end. And in our motivational research, we have found, you know, staying together, hanging together, eating together is more important than making the healthier food choice. These are certain elements that we have found from our ethnographic study, from our consumer insight survey, as well as our motivational study. So I think this irrational and unrestricted and all very much a peer-driven culture also very important to think about when you talk about this huge demographic dividend across the world, not only in Bangladesh. Now, how do you translate this research into action and work with stakeholders, bring everybody together? So we have to first unearth our motivations, that dissect it, that what are the drivers of motivation? What are the enablers? Where are the barriers? Why? Go deep into that. And this research, just I think, this is with all these students coming in this innovation lab, I think we can have an amazing design of research where we can go deeper into the motivation side and identify the insight stemming for motivation and translate this into action, working with multi-sector, multi-stakeholder, and multi-level stakeholders to come together, and adolescent at the center, young people at the center, to design and come up with these solutions. Because what we have realized, if we unearth the motivations, the typical way doesn't work. You know, with the old norm, like going back to your mother, sitting there, and I used to go to my mother now. Now adolescents go to their siblings, their peers, they go to others, their social network opens, social media open for them. They go there, they get excited and they make choices. Though we know out of the 10 diseases, 6 are due to diet, but they don't. I think we need to take them through us as a multi-sectoral platform and take them as a center to drive the change. And then powerless alone and empowered together, they feel that we can collect together our actions, and that's from these are very important. So what we realized that when we looked at the participatory workshop, we brought 200 adolescents together. We dig down that what they want. It is not about healthy food or choice. They're thinking about dreams. I like to become this. I want to become like this. And their dreams often don't fit with their parents' dream. Like, you know, I'm a doctor. I wanted to become a lawyer, but my mother wanted to do. So all these things, I want to be a dancer. But then they think about that, how I will be physically and mentally fit if I want to achieve my dream. Then they look at nourishing their dream. They think of food choices. So that's where the motivational research findings we can inbuild to nourish their thinking and build the food system in place. So we took this and we ran a pledge called Eat Well, Live Well campaign, whereby we said pledge that we will eat well, eat safe and healthier diet, whatever pocket money we have. And more than 1 million Bangladeshi adolescents pledged that yes, we will do it. We will be there, but give us options. Where I linked with Kat that the option means bring our private sector, supply side in. We can create demand, but if there is no action between demand and supply, there will be a gap and we will not be able to choose. Because when we are talking about the food system, we are talking about seed to stomach, and there are different level of consumer facing actions throughout the system. So taking this and taking this, and now my previous colleagues, talking about the UN food system, we looked at this and looked at the globe, that how do we can leverage the learning of Bangladesh and take it to the next level of the globe. So we started this campaign called Act for Food, Act for Change. And we are now having young leader champions from all over the world talk about choices, drivers of choices, the food system, but in a simpler way. As Dominic has highlighted and Ed has highlighted, that it's not easy to define food system for a younger generation. We have to make it easy for them to understand, for them make a choice that is more affordable, equitable, gender specific, gender sensitive, but also we need to understand that they need a desirability also built into it. This is their aspiration. So what are the learning and reflection? The traditional and motivational research improved our understanding of the local context. And it happened in different countries. We did it in Pakistan. We did it in other countries, in Kenya. But we need to give them adolescent perspective, providing valuable, compelling information for their to design. And motivation research and all these choices that we are building, why research is important, what are the findings of the research can facilitate the participatory process of the design, bringing all stakeholders together. And Inge was in Bangladesh, and we are doing this food system for healthier diet, and we are doing this diagram in a hotel, and we are seeing that how different puzzle can come together when we bring stakeholders, because we think from different angles: public sector, private sector, civil society, academia. We have to put our hands together, use these research findings to operationalize so that we can act for change, to make sure that we take safe and healthier diet, we change our diets, but it is affordable. We can demand that as well. So use of motivational research improves the capacity of this co-designing and relevant campaign intervention that resonate with our target audience. Here is adolescents. So some motivation may resonate with the context, some may not. But as I like to complement it here with Kat, that we use social media, we use radio, we use TV. So we use multiple channels to make sure that the motivation part and the ethnographic study findings are really used through a very participatory process with the stakeholders to bring a case whereby we stand all together to make sure that our future have the leadership they want. So the bhalo khabo bhalo thakbo means eat well to be well. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity.
Thanks a lot, Rudaba, with this very informative presentation on your adolescence project in Dhaka. I would like to continue now with the question and answer session. I think we got 3 very nice examples also on different, I would say, transformative pathways that are used, ranging from social movement or coalition building, as you did, Rudaba, to government directions, like Masresha actually was presenting, through building up different innovations and giving room to new ways of doing business, as Kat was presenting. And I think you all presented, one way of stakeholder involvement, which was extremely important for the success of your projects. So in the question and answer in the chat box, there were a few questions related to your project, Kat. I would say clarification questions. One of them is by Drafa. I hope Drafa is there still. And it's related to a question of Chuma as well, is how did you ensure that there's a diversity of products brought to the SPAR? And Chuma asked, was there any effort also to include indigenous foods or traditional foods, fruits and vegetables in the products that are offered by SPAR?
Great, thank you for the questions, Inge. And I would like to introduce also my colleague, Dr. Marlena Roofs, who is a key researcher and actually did most of this research, and she's much better able to answer these questions than I am. So
I'll do my best.
Welcome, Marlene. Welcome, Marlena.
Thank you very much.
Go ahead. Yes.
Yeah. With the SPAR, there was a real focus on vegetables that were in demand, say, among the SPAR store owners. So the purpose was not necessarily to present a large diversity of vegetables in the SPAR store, but to make sure that at least there was some variety and the supply of vegetables was, say, sufficient, reliable, and of a good quality. There was no specific effort made to include indigenous vegetables, although some SPAR stores, some SPAR store owners, and say fresh produce managers in these stores wanted to have indigenous vegetables, like local types of spinach, because the customers ask for it. So it's very demand driven. It wasn't supply driven.
Okay, thanks a lot. I think if we go to the different stakeholders that were involved, there's a question to Masresha on the involvement of pastoralists. Did the in the discussions on food system for healthier diets, were pastoralists or the situation of pastoralists actually considered? This is a question of Monica Agabe.
Thank you, Inga. Thank you, Monica. Yes, indeed, pastoral were well addressed in our food system, because in one of my presentation, the food system, food-based dietary guideline, and we are also developing a separate food-based dietary guideline for the pastoral community. And at the same time, and the pastoral community has also been involved as part of national dialogue, because as I mentioned, there has been a number of dialogues, and the first dialogues already undertaken. And in each of the dialogue, the pastoral community were well involved, especially stakeholders from the sub-national levels were participated. Academia also from the pastoral community were also addressed. With this, I think in my understanding, the pastoral issue is well addressed in Ethiopia. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Masresha. Then going back to Kat and Marlene again, there were two questions or two groups of stakeholders where we had questions about and whether they were involved and what their activities are. One group is on the farmers, and the question is, were farmers reluctant or really willing to grow certain fruits and vegetables? Or were there any detrimental impacts on farmers, for example? And this is a question of Claire.
Okay. The farmers were quite willing to participate, although they sometimes there were problems with say loyalty, and that was also because there was not that much security always for farmers in terms of that they were certain that when they produced such and such a volume that it would be taken off for a specific price at a certain time. So there were no sort of real contracts made, although there were sort of gentlemen's agreements, which would also mean that farmers that were not participating for a bit longer in this process would easily sell to another buyer that would offer a reasonable price. So often things were sold quickly. That negative effects to farmers? No, there were as far as I know, there were no detrimental effects. The only thing was that farmers were capacitated, they were trained, so there were quite some investments made so that the farmers could adhere to good local agricultural practices, and that increased sort of their access to markets.
We did focus the majority of the evaluation on the consumers in the stores. I don't know whether.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So this was Kat still, huh? We can't see her in the screen. Hi. Okay, so a next group of stakeholders that there was a question about by Bharat is, was government indeed an important stakeholder in your project? And as such, did they align, the production of farmers' production capabilities in accordance to the Eat Lancet recommendations, for example?
The government was the South African government was not a real formal partner in this project, although the project wanted to focus the rural hubs also on school feeding schemes. These are run by the South African government, and yes, the South African government has a food and nutrition security strategy and policy and an action plan. In which dietary considerations are prominent, but no, there's no direct relationship between this project, the government school feeding scheme, and the higher level policies that attend to dietary considerations. So there are different levels of government, but they do not have all the same focus.
Okay, okay, thanks, Marleen. That also answers the question of Sonia, I think, on the farmers as well. There's a question coming in from Emmanuel. I'm not sure, Emmanuel, for who this question is. Maybe it's for more. And you said that you like the element of the participatory research, which allows for co-creation. Probably that's related to what Rudaba presented. And your question is related to the stakeholder involvement, from the identification of research to the objective. And given that donors have predetermined objectives, what happens if the stakeholders propose a completely different objective? I think it's to Rudaba.
Yeah, so
Did
I think
you encounter it?
Yeah, I encountered it. So there are three pillars. First is that when we started the discussion, before even the design, when we thought about it, what is the gap? This is this came from when we did the food system for healthier diet paper. We realized there was no consumer facing studies. So we actually brought the donor, including the development partners, saying that there is a gap and everybody is really working towards this whole thing about bringing adolescents on board. So we thought that why don't we design something and present it with the adolescent from their side and share it. So initially there were quite a pushback because everybody wanted, some wanted some, we said motivational research, some wanted a different sort of research. So there's a lot of question of the research design and the question. So ultimately when you put the government, because they're the duty bearers, and we try to identify where is the gap, and if we do not do through an co-creation where adolescents are at the center of the thinking, it will be adults driving the force. Where we join hands with the government and different sectors and others. Still there is a gap. We are now trying to bring the private sector on board more and other research so that we can hear from them that wow, the supply side will be done. So the second pillar is that having more interaction and clarity on the research question, what we want to achieve, the objective, what do we want to achieve, and the question. And the third one is also having adolescents as part of the stake to share their own stories that actually drives because they are the one we are thinking of their future and the leadership role and the healthy choices of food, their affordability, and those elements are very critical when you talk about building a nation, productivity of a country, and building Bangladesh in the forefront. So these are some of the tactics and the strategies we used, and it worked. And because we also use the gender lens, so because of the gender gap, it also gave us a very positive experience. Thank you. Over.
Thank you, Rudaba. I think there's an interesting question for all three panel members. It's coming from Megan. It's about stakeholder engagement and actually reporting or monitoring stakeholder engagement. So the question to all three of you, and maybe I will start with Masresha first, is can you comment on better approaches actually for evaluating stakeholder engagement? Are you doing that in Ethiopia? Are you evaluating it, or is there a need to do so, or do you have experiences in it, Masresha?
Thank you, Inga. Yeah, in terms of stakeholder engagement, and there are different platforms. As I mentioned, there is food and nutrition policy and strategy. Under that document, there is a clear stakeholder that indicated at the policy document. So with that, there are stakeholders that relate, especially in terms of implementation, that directly involve implementation, especially the multi-sectorial approach, which is a number of ministerial sectors, including development partner, were there. And the other stakeholder, especially in terms of evidence, which the Ethiopian Public Health Institute is also part of that, and over 30 institutes that include the university, the academia, and the development partners, and also other government organizations are also there. So there is also a platform that the committee or a group are meeting. So there is, I can say there is a very good platform, especially in terms of food and nutrition, with the recent food system. And there is also a very nice platform which was already started with the food system, dialogues. And this is organized by two ministries, Ministry of Agriculture and Health. So I can say that the involvement stakeholder is quite, sufficient and active participation. But in terms of, evaluation, their effectiveness and the achievement in terms of this, stakeholder, it has to be evaluated. But there has been some evaluation quite a long time ago. But I can say this is an overview of, the stakeholder engagement in Ethiopia and what they are doing.
Okay, maybe Kat or Marlene, you can comment?
Oh, just reflecting on sort of how to evaluate what we do with stakeholders. I think one thing I was reflecting on actually based on the last question is that we really focused our evaluation on consumers and dietary diversity. And actually we didn't ask so many questions, for example, to the farmers directly. I think there could have been, and this comes back maybe to that key point we had around the tension between all of the different actors. So, it's hard to have this project that tries to span the whole value chain and to really, get the hubs going and to find out what the farmers think of it, find out what the consumers think. And there's so many different moving parts that you focus on one, but that is probably at the expense of the other. So we probably could have done more maybe to engage with the farmers and evaluate their perspectives, for example. Anything to add?
Okay.
Yeah, and in terms of sort of evaluating a multi-stakeholder processes, I find the discussion on motivation very interesting. So I think ultimately with this multi-stakeholder processes and when you are looking for collaboration between different actors, what is the motivation to collaborate, and how can you organize your review or evaluation on these different motivations among different partners. So I think that would be the interesting challenge.
Okay, thanks. And Rudaba, can you reflect on the question?
Thank you. So Bangladesh has a Bangladesh National Nutrition Council under the second National Plan of Action for Nutrition, where we pull together actually an M&E group, mentoring and evaluation group, because we realize that, and that coordinates with all the 23 ministries and also other public and different networks like SUN and others, and academia is there. So we realize that if we do it individually, it becomes very logo based, not a comprehensive, sustainable approach of evaluation. So then where we are putting the question that how to evaluate minimum indicator driven process where the stakeholders' motivation and the aspiration aligning with the government priorities. So I think that's why it worked for us, because that was in the priority, even maternal and child health. So I think the food system has become, especially as Mashresa said, that during this decade of action in the UN Food System Summit, food system has become it has got the traction now. So I think that's why this is the ideal time for us to bring and build that network and build that framework for evaluation with the government and other stakeholders together. And the stakeholders mean the people, we don't call them boss, I mean our people for whom we are here, our purpose. So I think that's the best option we can do it, and we have been trying it in Bangladesh. Sometimes successful, but I think most of the time the indicators are coming quite good, especially looking at the UN Food System Summit. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Rudama. I would like to thank all three of you, all panelists, giving us your insights and experiences with the project you presented. I think what Megan said, that we don't have a lot of information on evaluation of the impact of stakeholder engagement, is true. We should remember that and maybe elaborate on that and come back next year to present what we know about it. With this, I would like to turn back to Ed and Christine. We are almost at time. There are still some open questions, but I think we will try to answer them outside this session. Ed,
hey,
over to you.
Thank you, Inga, and our three panelists. If anyone has a burning question, please go ahead and raise your hand, but we only have a couple of minutes. One thing I wanted to ask each of the panelists to comment on very briefly is there were three fantastic examples that were different actions to try to bring about positive change. And I guess my brief question is, from your experience, is what you learned tell you that the strategy you used or that was used in the country in which you were working is something that others can use, or did you come away with this is very specific to your situation and really everybody needs to sort of figure it out for themselves in their own situation? Any comment about that? Because that relates to the transportability and sustainability of these ideas.
Yeah, thank you, Ed. I can just start for 1 minute. I think what I've learned from Kat and the Mashresa, I think it's a very replicable. If we use these learnings together, I can use it in Bangladesh, what I'm learning from the SPAR. It's a very, very relevant ones in the private sector. Same thing. So I think these are replicable, effective practices that can easily be translated into actions with the stakeholders. Thank you. Over.
Kat, do you want to comment?
Yes, I also think that what we did was quite replicable. I think, South Africa is maybe a bit different than other African contexts where people get most of their vegetables from supermarkets, but I think this is sort of what many countries will be going towards in the next, say, 15, 20, 30 years. And we have also, SPAR has actually redesigned that hub. So it's actually much more of a virtual hub now. So it connects small scale farmers digitally to sort of the farms and actually removes the physical building. So it is iterative. And I think, as we iterate and learn, we can then share that. And I think it would be applicable to other countries.
Okay, great. Ms. Rasha, do you want to comment at all?
Yes, and most of the policy or the flagship initiative that the government of Ethiopia is doing could be replicable, as others said. For example, the food-based dietary guideline, every country has to be the food-based dietary guideline. I think most are maybe some of the high-income country already have this guideline, but the other low middle income, I don't think they have all. So this could be replicable. And the other project, even some of the project, the flagship, which I presented, were also from other country, which we already receive some of the other countries' experience. And the other thing, maybe I think other country could replicate is the dialogue, which especially on food system and dialogues, especially the dialogues which a number of stakeholders identified in terms of identifying the game changer, especially in terms of food system, and a number over 1,000 idea came, and for each idea there has been a proposed intervention. So finally, about 22, this game changer idea were, selected and also intervention. So I think this could directly, the system could be replicable to many other countries. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So I'm going to, we're at time. I'm going to turn it to Christine for her closing.
Okay, thank you, Ed, and thank you all for joining us today. I want to thank our fantastic co-leaders and moderators, Chris Turner and Inga Brower. We couldn't have done this without you, clearly. It has been a pleasure working with you over these past few weeks to put this Learning Lab together. I'm going to truncate my comments and just skip right to the end and say I'd like to thank our panelists for sharing their knowledge and experience in food system science and stakeholder engagement for promotion of sustainable healthy diets. And the lessons shared today have, as we just ended, with applicability across contexts and can be used to push the boundaries in food systems change and demand creation for healthy diets. And before we go, I'd like to extend a thank you to our funders, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the UK AID, for their support of the Drivers of Food Choice program. And finally, the fantastic ANH team for hosting this year's meeting under, again, difficult circumstances, and for making the most of the virtual platforms and making it possible for us to engage in this Learning Lab dialogue with you all today. So thank you.
Thank you so much. This was an excellent Learning Lab to close out our Academy Week. Thanks so much to all the facilitators for joining us today, and for the audience, of course, for participating. I just want to provide some closing remarks. Just to finish us out, if you have any questions about the ANH Week, don't hesitate to email us at anh-academy@lshtm.ac.uk. I also want to point you all to some exciting new resources that the ANH Academy has launched. We have some teaching resources available that might be useful for helping deliver agriculture, nutrition, and health interdisciplinary topics. And we're also launching a new mentoring scheme next week. And so I invite you all to take a look at the link if you're interested in joining as a mentor and eventually a mentee. So thank you all so much again for participating through this first week of Learning Labs, and hopefully we'll see you next week as we undergo the research conference. Have a good one. Oh, and thank you. Oh, sorry. And really quick, also, their evaluation form has been launched as a poll. So please take just a couple of seconds before you log off to fill that out for us. All right, I think I'm going to close the meeting now. It was great seeing everyone. Have a good start to your weekend.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks, Christine.
Thank
and
you,
Ed.
everyone.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you, Inga.
Bye.
Thanks all.
Bye, Chris. Thank you.